Welcome to our program Voices. Today in Voices, we have Brinda Karat, an outspoken advocate for social justice that includes socio-economic justice, environmental justice, gender rights, and more. She's also a member of the CPIM, Communist Party of India Marxist Politburo. Welcome to the program, Brinda. We'll start by talking about the book Delhi's Agony, in which you have written the foreword. Delhi's Agony is a collection of essays by leading writers, activists, artists, journalists, and also a former judge. And it talks about the terrible violence that happened in Delhi in February 2020, in which more than 50 people were killed. Most of them are Muslims, and many more were wounded. What are you trying to say through this book, Delhi's Agony?
The first point, I think, is that this is the capital of India. And the capital of India has not seen this kind of violence directed against the Muslim community since the 1950s. We have, of course, seen the horrific violence in 1984 targeted against the Sikh community. And that also was certainly with the rule of the state at that time under the leadership of the Congress Party after the assassination of our Prime Minister, Srimati Indira Gandhi. This violence against the Muslim community is different in the sense that one can say there was absolutely nothing spontaneous about it, nor was it triggered by any specific event. This was really part of the general political toxic campaign of those in power in India today, namely the Bharatiya Janata Party, for whom communal division has become a default electoral strategy. So in Delhi, before the February violence, there was an electoral campaign because the elections in Delhi Assembly were scheduled. And as you know, and as your viewers will know, we have the AAP government here in Delhi. And therefore, the one-point agenda of the BJP was how to unseat the AAP. At the same time, there was also a very widespread campaign against what we consider an unconstitutional law, which was called the Citizen Amendment Bill, Citizenship Amendment Law, the CAA. And this is basically changing the premise of citizenship in India, which at present is constitutionally defined, to make it defined according to religion. So this is a very radical change which was being suggested through this law. So there was a huge campaign, as you know, and a huge movement against it all over India. So basically the violence in Delhi is linked to a political agenda sponsored by those who are holding state power today. And there was nothing spontaneous about it.
Mm-hmm. So what are the essays trying to convey in this? We can see that
the essays are linked to the report which had been written by the Citizen Relief and Rehabilitation Committee, of which the CPIM was a major component. And it is those activists who went around and got primary data on the details of the violence. And we had published a report on the Delhi violence. And our publishers, which is Leftward, were quite impressed with the report. And they circulated that report to many of the authors of that book, who then wrote about their own experiences about communal violence. There are 2-3 essays in this book which are directly related to own experience. For example, Nasruddin Shah's writing or T.M. Krishna's writing. So these are directly linked to their own experiences of what it means to be a citizen in India today. And others have written, political essays or essays of their understanding of the Indian state. And I think put together, it's quite an important contribution to the struggle for constitutional values of secularism and democracy.
Brinda, BJP seems very well entrenched at the center, and many believe that they or their politics of Hindutva is now almost pervading across party lines. Where do you see this heading, and what can really be done about this by left organizations like yours and people who are bothered by it?
I think you flagged a very, very important issue, which is really understated in India, because very often people see the role of the BJP mainly in terms of their electoral victories. And when we say entrenched, people often link that to the huge majority they have in parliament, which of course is a very important aspect of entrenchment. But I think what you have raised goes beyond that. And what you are talking about is an entrenchment also of the ideology that they represent, which is Hindutva ideology. And in your question, you have said that it seems to pervade different political parties. What I would first say is that it is true that the basis of Hindutva, which is really a political project, as we know, and we're not going to go into the details here of how Savarkar defined Hindutva, but certainly those who would like to study it would certainly like to read Savarkar's book on Hindutva. But what I would say is that they have to a great extent succeeded in trying to build a unity on the issue of Hindu identity, an overarching Hindu identity. And this seems to be pervasive. And we see that reflected all across India in the ritualization of religious belief, in the homogenization of Hindu practices, which was never there, in even the homogenization of Hindu gods in a particular kind of hierarchy. And also the effort politically to develop a kind of right-wing identity politics among marginalized sections to try and highlight the aspect of Hindu identity. So that is one big project. And very unfortunately, this is all based on the mixing up of religion and politics. So when you find other bourgeois parties who also use religious symbols as part of political symbols, for example, the AAP, who are now saying they're going to spend public money on religious pilgrimages, or you have the West Bengal chief minister who's suddenly taken to reciting shlokas on her stage, or you have the Congress leaders, both Rahul and Priyanka ji, who are going around visiting temples and making sure they, get photographed doing it, etc. I mean, I'm not going to all the, but yes. So what this basically is, I think, is compromising with the fundamental aspect of secularism, which must always be the separation of religious belief from your politics. But if all parties are going to do it, who is it helping? Obviously, it's helping the BJP Hindutva agenda. I won't say all these parties believe in Hindutva. No, I won't say that. But certainly the struggle against Hindutva, they are compromising on a key aspect, which is separation of religion from politics. But Hindutva, of course, as we know, is much more than that. So that is the thing here. And therefore, I appreciate your raising that question because, we tend to just think of it in terms of votes. It's much more than that. It's really the aspect of minds more than votes and hearts more than votes. And therefore, the left is quite uncompromising on this aspect of it. So I believe that right now, one of the biggest issues is the defense of the Constitution of India, which has secularism as a very important tenet in its preamble.
Thanks. Also, just a few days ago, PM Modi announced the repeal of the controversial farm laws, and many saw this as a victory of a people's movement. And of course, there are others who advise against complacency. What do you think are the big battles ahead? I mean, does it really mean the agrarian crisis is really over, or there's a lot more to it than just the repeal of the farm laws? Of course, the crisis is not over. So could you tell us a little bit about how complex the problem is, and farmers' issues go a lot beyond just the farm laws?
Well, really, I think all over the world, Indian citizens had come out in different mobilizations in support of farmers. And well, it's a huge historic victory of farmers. It's a historic victory of farmers after a historic struggle. I think one of the most sustained, well-organized, and extremely united struggle of Kisans of India against three farm laws, which were really directed to take forward the present regime's agenda of corporatization of agriculture as a response to agrarian distress. And that, of course, is linked to the patterns of production, of crop production, the issue of food security, the issue of prices for consumers, and most important of all, the issue of the produce of the farmers. So when we talk about the agrarian crisis, we have an understanding and a vision of how it can be addressed. And one of them actually is to ensure that there is a minimum support price for farmers' produce. And this is in direct conflict with what corporates want, which big agribusinesses want, and the whole invitation to agribusinesses, not only Indian corporates, but multinational big corporates too. So the farmers were fighting, of course, for their own direct relief issues, but their struggle was a much bigger one, which has big implications for policy directions. And the fact that the Modi regime has had to literally step back in a very, very comprehensive manner is a huge victory. And I think it has implications for other struggles of workers on, the complete elimination of working class protections, which they fought for so many decades to and established a legal framework of a certain, at least a certain protective framework, which is just being destroyed. So the importance of the farmer struggle, and the fact, I think, which we should also note, is that it organically developed into a huge political challenge to the Modi government. That is what I think is very important, because it reaffirms the politics of mass struggle instead of, opportunists coming together at the time of elections. So it emphasizes the importance of mass struggle as a method of transforming politics and political relations in this country.
So you mentioned, the labor laws, the changes to the labor laws that are being gradually implemented. And of course, CPIM has a long association with the union movement. Could you tell us a little bit about the kind of changes that are being brought about that go against the workers' rights?
Well, what they have done is, in the name of merging laws, we now have 4 labor codes. And these labor codes deal with different aspects and sections of workers. One of the most critical attacks which have taken place is that one of the demands of, the whole neoliberal framework and advocacy and following of policies is really the aspect of employment, hire and fire. And what is the framework to hire a worker and fire a worker? And what are the labor conditions of service? These are 2 very critical aspects. And corporates in India and abroad have been saying that Indian laws are, very stringent, and therefore we want to fire whenever, as and when we need to. So what they have done is they have now introduced what is called a fixed time. So in other words, any employer can say, okay, I'm going to employ you just for 6 months in a job which has a permanent nature. So this basically is giving corporates the right to fire at will without any conditions to protect workers' service condition, their wages, their pensions, their provident fund, etc., etc. So basically what it means is that we are going 75 years back where wages also are not going to be fixed because it's contractual labor. There's a huge change to legalize contractual labor in jobs which are of a permanent nature. And that is actually going against many judgments of the Supreme Court also. And if you look at migrant workers, now there is a special law for migrant workers, which is weak enough and inadequate in the first place. What is our experience of migrant workers' vulnerability? It's been huge during the pandemic. And I think all over the world, Indians saw to their horror the conditions of work of migrant workers having to trek back home. But now they have totally eliminated even that inadequate law. And now they are saying, we're going to have portals to give you work and to register you, etc. There was already a law for that, which you never implemented. And now you've eliminated that law. So similarly, in many, many areas, they are eliminating the rights which workers have. They are making workers vulnerable due to reduction in protection in service conditions. And basically, you're on contract. And contract means at the whims and fancies of what the corporates want. So it is really a destruction of the framework of protective laws we have had in India.
Okay.
And workers are fighting against it. And of course, that is now linked with privatization, handing over public assets, as a gift to the private sector. And in fact, the private sector is now, it's not the workers bargaining with government. It's the private sector and corporates now bargaining with government saying, oh, you want to sell this? Well, make the conditions even better for us. So that's really what's happening in India. It's a corporatization of India.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we heard so much about the farmers' resistance. Is enough happening in India? Is there a big enough campaign to protect workers' rights in a big way?
Very much so. Yeah. There's a very huge campaign. And in fact, the trade unions have now given a call for a 2-day strike sometime in February during the next budget session. So that's going to be a very, very big action. And I think this sort of, it's part of the global movement of the fight back of labor against capital. And I think that's also very important to see, because if you look even globally and you look at the whole change in labor service conditions against the workers, and even if you look globally at the reducing share of wages in costs of production. I mean, it's happening all over the world. And India is one of the countries where the workers are organized. We have a strong trade union movement, and there's a big fight back. So I think class issues are very much on the agenda against political and against the policies of the present regime.
Okay, and of course, there was the effort to corporatize the farming sector. Increasingly, public sector is being privatized. National assets are being sold. Doesn't all that go? Against the very cause we are fighting for, the more private. The businesses and the manufacturing facilities that employs people, or the sectors that employ people, the greater the dilution of workers' rights. So
it even goes beyond that, because what you're really affecting, of course, workers' rights is a critical aspect, but I believe privatization and the liberalization policies of selling off the public sector is also very much affecting our strategic industries which are the backbone of India's sovereignty. So when we talk about an attack on the Constitution, we were talking about secularism as a tenet in the preamble. We also have sovereignty. And I believe that the privatization of public assets in defense, in aviation, in critical areas, in the entire finance sector. I mean, in 2008, if India saved itself, at least to some extent, against the assault of finance capital on the world's economic system and the huge crisis, it is precisely because of India's robust public sector banking and insurance. And today, banking and insurance are in the target range of the present Bharatiya Janata Party regime. And therefore, I believe that destroying this backbone of India, it is, of course, an issue of workers' rights, but equally, it is an issue of sovereignty. It's an issue of defending India's independence. And right now, we are literally, we're linking ourselves to, the chariot of those countries who are known to have destroyed.
So what do you say to those who say that it's in the interest of efficiency? I mean, the private sector and in the financial services sector and the manufacturing sector has helped companies and products become more competitive and made the country more competitive in the global marketplace.
Well, competition as far as maximization of profit is concerned, certainly I think they're extremely efficient about that. I mean, in the last year of pandemic, our big corporates made 13 trillion in profits, while, the income of the lowest 70% or 80% was less than 10,000 rupees a month. So inequalities certainly have grown, and inefficiency. If you talk about efficiency, where is the efficiency? The efficiency happens to be when you subsidize corporates, the way corporates are being subsidized today by this government.
That's a very valid point.
So you shifted the subsidy from the workers, the marginalized, and the poor, and you've shifted that subsidy to the rich. As far as tax concessions goes, as far as writing off bank loans are concerned, is that efficiency? That you have huge loans on your accounts and they're just written off, so you can show profits and make profits because you're not paying back your loans from public sector banks. So I don't consider that a hallmark of efficiency at all.
And how serious, and what do you think will be the long-term implications of the increasing privatization of the healthcare sector and the education sector, which is so essential to reducing inequity among different class of people, the marginalized people and the privileged?
Well, that's exactly the point. I mean, what has privatization of health meant in the whole world today in the dealing of this coronavirus? It's exactly the privatization of health services which have led to this, what I would say, man-made crisis as far as deaths, illnesses, hospitalization, access to medicine, etc. are concerned. And in India, it has been particularly bad because the government has refused to even acknowledge its utter failure. I mean, here in Delhi, in the capital of India, people were gasping for breath because there was a huge shortage of oxygen supplies. And in Parliament, the government says we don't have details of oxygen-related, lack of oxygen-related deaths. I mean, this is the kind of framework that we're in here in India. So privatization of health, privatization of education also, all our surveys have shown that in rural India and in large parts of urban India, where the poor live, in the slums of India, you had a percentage of something like between 85 to 93% who had no access to online education because they don't have the wherewithal. So online education and digital education, which was pushed by the private sector and education, by the government, has proved to be an absolute disaster. And unfortunately, a model like the Kerala model, which is a model which has been crafted by the communists in government in Kerala, both in the health sector and in the education sector, have proved time and time again that if you use your resources for basic universal needs of the people, the state also develops, which is why today Kerala can compete on all social indicators as far as health, education, income, social justice is concerned, with some of the most developed countries in the world. So we do have an alternative vision, which is a left vision, which when we have the opportunity to not only frame policies, but implement them in government, we have shown that that works.
We'll come back to left politics a bit later. You've also been quite intimately and deeply involved with Adivasi issues. And of course, it was not so long ago that Father Stan Swami tragically lost his life under very tragic circumstances after being incarcerated for several months, and in spite of poor health and wide appeals for his release. Give us an idea of the range of challenges and issues that India's indigenous people, the Adivasis, face, and of course also the Dalits, the downtrodden people.
Father Stan Swami's death was a murder, actually. It was a custodian murder. It was an institutionalized murder. And his death was foretold. And he saw it himself. And in his last statement, he said, "I know you're killing me here. Just send me back to my people." And when he was saying my people, he was not talking about, his people in the church, but he was talking about the people he was serving, which is basically his work in Jharkhand was among the Adivasi communities. And he brought out a very important detail which dogs the lives of Adivasis today, which is the incarceration of so many innocent Adivasis on trumped-up charges in the name of being Maoist and being involved in the Naxalite movement. And Father Stan Swami's research, along with his colleagues in the Jesuit order, had shown that there were thousands of Adivasis locked up in Jharkhand jails for years as under trials who had no access to justice. Now in Chhattisgarh, after the Congress government came, after the BJP regime, they also had set up a commission of inquiry into this and found that a large number of Adivasis were locked up in jails under the BJP regime in the name of being Maoists, who were absolutely innocent. And therefore, the whole Salva Judo movement in Chhattisgarh, crafted by the Bharatiya Janata Party, took a very heavy toll of Adivasis. So one aspect is justice for the Adivasis who today are still in jail on trumped-up charges and who have no access to justice because of their own poverty-stricken circumstances. So that was an important issue which Stan Swami raised, which I believe is still very relevant today and which is being taken up by the left and by Adivasi organization. The second most critical aspect, which we all know about, is the forced evictions and the displacement of Adivasi communities from their rights and forests. Of course, as we know, this started during the British regime, when the owners of the forests, the protectors of the forests of India, the Adivasi communities, were suddenly turned as encroachers on their own land. Now, if I come and say, where you are sitting today, you're an encroacher, and throw you out. So that's what's happened to millions of Adivasis. They are around 8.9% of India's population today. And they are, their habitats are in, 3/4 of all Adivasi communities have lived in forests. And now for various reasons, primarily, if you look at the last 20 years of, privatization of mining, so-called development projects, of huge projects of development. It could be an irrigation project, it could be an electricity project, it could be just taking water from the Adivasi communities. So that land, which is Adivasi land, that is primarily the focus of the government's policies, to evict them. Now we have a law in India, and it was passed in 2006 called the Forest Rights Act, which sought to address the historical injustices which Adivasi communities face. And at that time, I was a member of parliament representing the CPIM, and I was, along with two other colleagues, both from the tribal communities, Comrade Babu Riang, M. Babu Rao from Andhra Pradesh, and Bajabang Riang from Tripura. So three of us were in that select committee. And we fought hard, along with our colleagues in that committee from various political parties. And we did have this law. There are inadequacies in that law, but still, it is a very important right which Adivasis have. And that today is the fault line. The law and its rights on the one side, and the pro-corporate policies of the government on the other, and their targeted approach on every single policy to incrementally, step by step, take away the legal and constitutional rights. And one of the central points is the role of the Gram Sabha. What is a Gram Sabha? It is a village gathering, legally recognized. So these laws, which we fought for and got, a range of them, fought for primarily by the Adivasis themselves and represented by different political parties, mainly the left, was the role of the village community, the Gram Sabha, which is a legal entity under the Panchayat laws and the Forest Rights Act, and other, I'm not going to go into all the details of the legal frame. So the rights of the community to decide projects in their area, their choice of what constitutes development, their mandatory consent for such, which also requires giving up some of their land. So without all that, you're just bulldozing your tyrannical majority that you have. A majority, really. It's to impose tyranny on these communities, destroy their democratic rights, take away their land, displace them, make them destitute. And there's a series of such amendments which are being brought by the government of India today, which are a frontal attack. And I would say it's an undeclared war on the rights of Adivasi communities in India today by the BJP. And on the other hand, you have the RSS. I don't know if your viewers are aware that the Bharatiya Janata Party is a frontal political organization of a more sinister organization called the Rashtriya Swayam Seva Samiti. And their agenda is to Hinduize everything. So the Adivasi and indigenous, what you call indigenous communities, Adivasi cultures, and their different beliefs, those are sought to be homogenized to convert all this into some great Hindu identity in which Hindu gods and goddesses are transformed into Adivasi idols. And Adivasi cultures are sought to be eliminated in a quote unquote genteel fashion. So, you know, this is what's happening. So it's an all-round attack, really. And I tell you, privatization is also linked to this. because you're privatizing mines, you're privatizing minerals, and you're giving them all the concessions to go into the forest. And then you say, okay, then you have afforestation, this whole thing of climate change and the way that is translated into reality here. So you cut down trees, you cut down forests, you destroy community resources and community rights. And then you tell the corporates, okay, so you give the value of the forest. So you have to pay a certain amount of cash. And that cash then is used to build better roads for the corporates to take their minerals out of the forest. I'm sorry, and this, this is like but I just want to tell you, because it's so, I mean, one feels so angry about this, because now on this whole thing of climate change and India's big contribution to it, who's actually going to contribute? It's the Adivasis. Their land is being taken over by corporates. And in the name of afforestation on Adivasi land, you're going to plant trees, which could well be commercial trees for timber or for paper or for whatever, but certainly not for Adivasis.
So the expenditure on infrastructure in this area is more for the benefit of the very corporates that are taking over these lands rather than
exactly.
Lands. Good point. And that takes us to the last bit of left politics. You've been a member of CPIM's Politburo, and if I remember correctly, the first woman to be on that. And of course, India is facing crisis on inequity, socio-economic justice, environment, law and order, persecution of minorities, and a whole lot of other issues. At the same time, I mean, this would be a situation where left politics should prosper, should have appeal to the most marginalized communities, a major chunk of the population. But as we have seen in recent years, your presence, at least in the formal electoral success, has shrunk in Bengal, in Tripura, in the last elections. It would not be wrong to say that left parties got completely wiped out. Why is do you still have enough grassroots mobilization, from what I understand, at universities, at colleges, at various levels? There's a lot of interest in left politics. Why is not translating? Is it not translating into electoral gains for the left in elections?
Well, it's absolutely true that our main setback in electoral politics has, been a huge, devastating impact on us and on the party and on the left movement in general. And that basically is because our position in West Bengal from 2011, when we lost the government in West Bengal, we were defeated, up till 2021, where we could not get a single seat in the state assembly. So there's no getting away from the fact that it has been a very grave setback to us. And I would also like to just, take this opportunity to bring another aspect of this, which is the huge, unprecedented physical violence that communists have faced in West Bengal. Today, there are elections going on in Tripura. Supreme Court is hearing a petition, ironically, by the TMC under Mamata Banerjee, which says we are being attacked in Tripura. Today in Tripura, all the booths in Agartala have been forcibly captured by the Bharatiya Janata Party. The CPM also went to court. Today, right now, as we speak, there is a huge demonstration going on outside police headquarters in Agartala because of capturing of election booths. In West Bengal from 2011 to 2021, hundreds of CPIM supporters, cadre, voters were physically eliminated. They were killed. I have met and fought for. Women members of the CPIM who faced sexual assault because they declared themselves as communist. There were more than 1 lakh CPIM supporters, members, who were forced to leave their homes. There are over 100,000 cases filed against CPIM supporters in West Bengal. So the electoral victory of the TMC in West Bengal after 2011, between 2011 and 2016, primarily was on the soil of a state which was stained by the blood of hundreds of communists and the sacrifices of our people. I don't think any communist party in the world living in a parliamentary democracy as we do in India can face that kind of repression and still remain standing. And I personally, having seen it, witnessed it, been part of the struggle against it, I can tell you today, the fact that today the red flag is there in Bengal in every single struggle of the people is something which shows that in spite of the repression we faced, we are there still on the soil of Bengal. Mm-hmm. And in the recent by-elections, in fact, we got over 21% of the vote. So there is a fight back. We made mistakes. I'm not just blaming it on repression. We made mistakes. There was, a certain kind of attitude which developed, which alienated us from the people after 30 years in the power of the state government. So there was a gap that developed. There's no doubt about it. Mm-hmm. And we recognize that. But I don't think any party in the world has faced the kind of repression we have in a parliamentary democracy I'm talking about, not where parties are banned.
Especially in Bengal.
So what I'm trying to say, Deepak, basically is that there is a fight back. And as communists, we have to recognize our own weaknesses and mistakes, because if we don't, we will never be able to move forward. Mm-hmm. So we have recognized it. We have paid the price for our mistakes, and we are in the process of the big fight back.
But the gainer in Bengal seems to be the BJP since the last elections. I mean, your vote share has shrunk to less than 5%. BJP seems to have gained rather than the TMC. And the other question, of course, I had is, if you have popular support, grassroots support, is it really possible for any amount of booth capturing to really defy that kind of popular support?
No, it's very different because it's state-backed terror. It's not just two parties fighting, it's a state-backed terror. It's the police which are there. It's the forces which are there. And in that case, it was both the central forces and the state police forces which were against her. So it's not just some kind of a party level thing. It's very much state-based and state-supported. So it cannot be compared to what popular support is. If people are not allowed to vote, how do they do it? If somebody goes to a house and said, if you come out tomorrow, your child is going to be kidnapped from her school, what would you do? This is the reality. This is what's happening. And today it's happening in Tripura by the BJP. So the lesson BJP has learned in Bengal is to act like the TMC did against the CPIM, what the BJP is doing in Tripura. That's exactly what they are doing.
Okay.
So that kind of electoral politics where the communists and the left is the major opposition or is in power, that is a different kind of, a different kind of destruction of the very right to vote in India, because there are lakhs of people who are not allowed to vote.
Also, do you think there's there's a need for the left movement to reorder itself and make people who actually represent speak for themselves. I mean, do you have young leaders coming up? Because the faces of the party, at least we see, are still, they've been around for many, many years. I mean, there's you.
Yes, and that's a very good
And there's
point.
Yeshuri, and they are
Absolutely right. And of course, we have so many wonderful young women and men who are on the streets fighting. And that's a very important point because, in fact, we are making big changes all through the party right now because we have now established just a 3-term limit for secretaries of the party at all levels. We are putting age limits of newer entrants who can come into committees, and we're trying to lower the age of members of committees, and to give an opportunity, constitutionally mandatory, to bring younger people in.
Okay.
So let's hope that in the next 10 years you'll see that big change.
And what is the outreach of your party in the overseas Indian diaspora?
We do have very good contacts internationally with different aspects of movements. There are people who have specific platforms for secularism. There are those who are working class organization like the Indian Workers Association in the in the UK, similarly in Canada also. So in Australia also we have many groups who are working quite closely with the left in India, and specifically the CPIM. So we do have, but it's always much less if you look at it than what the Hindutva forces are. So any and every new contact we can establish, we would certainly be very welcoming to any other new platforms which would like to associate with us in any way.
Brinda Karat.
I'm so happy that you're doing such a wonderful job.
Thank you. And thank you for talking to us, Brinda. It's been wonderful talking to you and sharing your thoughts. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much for having me on your program.